Planning Committee A. I'm Councillor Johnny Crawshaw. I'm the chair for this committee. I'm joined on my right by Becky Eads, who's the head of planning, and to the right of her by Jonathan Kenyon, who's the principal officer for development management. On my left, I've got Ange Bealby as the democracy officer, and to the left of her is Rahina Chowdhury as the senior solicitor. Down each side of the tables are the members of the committee, and you will be getting to know those people, I'm sure, as we go through this meeting. So if I can just first of all do a bit of housekeeping, we're not expecting there to be a fire alarm at all today. So if the alarms do go off, we'll adjourn the meeting and we'll all be leaving by the nearest available exit. And for the members in the public gallery, we'll make sure you know your way out. If I can just remind people to make sure your phones are turned off or on silent. Anybody in the public gallery who's needing to use the toilet, you can go through the doors that are over my left shoulder, but just remind members of the committee that you mustn't leave during the hearing of an individual item. But I will be taking short adjournments as we move between agenda items. And one final thing just to note for anybody watching in particular, you will see members of the committee with their laptops open. That's because a lot of business of the council is moving to paperless, and so people are using their laptops to read the papers, not to search the internet or go looking on social media or anything like that. So it is very much a business meeting of the council today, and that's what we're all here for. So just to let people know how the meeting will run today, obviously committee members will be very familiar with this, but for anybody watching who perhaps hasn't seen a planning meeting previously, we do follow a set structure. So first of all, shortly I'll be inviting the officers to talk through the plans on each individual item. We then have an opportunity for committee members to ask any questions on the specific details of the plans. We then receive any updates that there might be on the report before moving into public participation. And this is an opportunity for anybody who wishes to speak either for or against the application to come and address the committee and potentially answer questions from committee members. We then go to general questions on the report and anything that we may have heard, and that's questions that are directed to the planning officers who will talk us through any specific details in the report before we move into debate. And that's the opportunity for committee members to talk through the planning balance, things that they think are positive, things that they have any concerns about. And then once we've had that debate, we then test the officer recommendation. So every planning application comes with a recommendation from officers, and the protocol is that we test that recommendation first. If that recommendation falls, then we seek any alternative ways of managing the application. And if it is met, then that becomes the end of that item and we move on to the next or close the meeting. So with all of that said, I just need to inform you of apologies. We've just had one apology for today's meeting, and that's from Councillor Eyre, who is being substituted by Councillor Fenton. So welcome. And I can then move us on to the main agenda and agenda item 1, which is declarations of interest. So if I can just invite anybody who has an interest in relation to anything to show, Councillor Steels-Walshaw.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I am a member of the British Sugar Community Forum in my role as a councillor. I don't believe I've said anything previously which gives the appearance of bias or predetermination, and can look at this with an open mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further? I'm not seeing any other hands. So it can move us then to agenda item 2, which is minutes of previous meetings. We've got 2 sets of minutes to approve today. So the minutes for the meeting that was held on the 18th of January start on page 3. If I can just see that everybody's happy that they're an accurate record. Yeah, seeing nods, so that's fine. And then the meeting that was held on the 8th of February, which begin on page 15. I've just got one amendment that I wish to make, which is on page 19, 3rd paragraph down, there's a reference to Councillor Melly receiving some legal advice, and we just would like to delete regarding future funding arrangements, as this doesn't quite capture what was discussed and it was confidential advice. So if we just delete that, so it reads, Councillor Melly sought legal advice from the senior solicitor. Following this advice, she withdrew from the meeting at 3:13. There's nothing else that I think needs to be amended. So if everybody else is happy, we'll take those as an accurate record. Thank you. So then we move to agenda item 3, which is the public participation on the general remit of the committee. We haven't had anybody register to speak for that, so we can go on to the plans list. Now, you will probably have seen in the press, but I can now formally tell you that the agenda item 4A, which is the application for St Peter's School, has been withdrawn. So we can skip straight past that to agenda item 4B, which begins at page 81 of your report, and that's for the enterprise rent-a-car, 15 Foss Islands Road, erection of 3, 4 and 5 storey student accommodation with associated car parking following demolition of the existing buildings. So I think if I can invite Jonathan to talk us through the plans on this.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So as Councillor Crawshaw says, Foss Islands Road for student accommodation, 3 to 5 stories. It's a resubmission of a scheme that was refused by members at committee last July. There were 2 reasons for refusal. They related to employment land and issues around accessibility. And when I take you through the slides, I'll show you what changes have been made since the previous decision. So this is the application site. There is a supermarket to the north, to the east. We've got blocks of apartments to the south, terraced housing and apartments also. And to the west of the site is the inner ring road, the city walls beyond that. The site is outside of the conservation area. These are photos of the existing structures on the site. Further perspectives from north looking back towards the site, and again south into the site, the 3-story white building with a front gable facing the street, being the application site. These photos are perspectives from the city walls, again looking directly at the site. See the apartment block in the background beyond the site. This is a view into the back of the site. Again, those apartment blocks that I showed you previously in the background. You can see the 4-story building there. This one is a view into the site from the southeastern corner. So these are the buildings on the site. That's the back of the 3-story building that's white on the other side. This is a 2-story building within the site, assumed to be the former station master's house associated with the railways that used to be in that area on Foss Islands Road. Note the change in ground levels. The application site at the back here is considerably lower than the surrounding streets and the surrounding blocks of apartments. It's another view towards the rear of the site. This is where the access for the waste collection is proposed. Further view into the sites. Again, this is some of the houses on the eastern side, the blocks of apartments that face towards the sites. So this is the site plan. This sort of southeastern corner and these apartment blocks, they're the houses that we've been looking at on the photos, and this eye shape is the planned form of the building. There's a forecourt to the front where cars can come in and out, so that allows for drop off away from the ring road, and there's 3 vehicle parking spaces on there for accessible parking, and there's a further 4th space that would be for servicing. So this is just the ground floor. It's no change compared to the previous scheme. That the front area is communal space, and then further back into the scheme is the apartment blocks orientated towards a sort of courtyard type areas. Got cycle storage at the back, which is a sort of lower floor, and that access is through this northern courtyard, and then this covered way at the side of the building. This is the 1st floor, so you've got the bin storage on the 1st floor because that's aligned with the pavement level at the back. So this is directly onto the street there. there's more communal space on the first floor compared to previous. I can run you through that in a later slide. So one of the changes with the floor plans, one of the reasons members had issue with the scheme previously was there was just a single lift, and there was concerns as to how people would move through the building if that lift was out of order. This scheme introduced a second lift in that location, so we have 2 lifts. These plans are just working through the upper floors. So that's the arrangement on the 2nd floor. 3rd floor, where it's step back, so it's lower facing the street, higher at the rear end of the site. And that's the very top floor, where the rooms are partially in the roof. And you can see how the scale is recessed here. And you've got these 3 gable ends which face towards the apartments opposite. That's the roof. There's sort of all the rectangles, sorry, that's the PV array that's on the roof there. These plans show amenity spaces within the building. There was an issue members had previously that all the amenity space was at the ground floor around the entrance, and there was a lack of different types of spaces within the building, and there weren't so much communal spaces on the upper floor, given that the apartments are all studio type apartments. So we've got a breakdown that explains that there's just over 500 meters squared of amenity space within the building. The bulk of that is on the ground floor as previous, but on the upper floors, if we're working through it. So on the 1st floor, we have a communal room here, which equates to sort of 3 rooms. And then on each of the upper floors, there's a common room towards the rear of the building by the circulation area where the lifts and staircase are. And then on the top floor, there's another communal room here in the centre of the plan. Final drawings, these show the elevation treatments. So that's the top one is elevation at the front, and the back is elevations at the rear. So you can see the mix of 3 up to 5 story. This line here shows you the boundary treatment and street level beyond the eastern side of the site. These slides show this is a side elevation. So this side is the street side where it's 3 story, and you can see how it steps up to 5 story and how it relates to the ground levels here where the adjacent apartments are. That's other side elevation, again showing how it steps up, how the arrangement of rooms are. This shows you've got the gable end there, so that's just the end of a corridor, so you've not got overlooking to the apartments to the south there. This one shows the mix of materials that are proposed. The brickwork is proposed. The main one is like a brown multi-brick, as is shown here, so it wouldn't quite be as grey as what's alluded to on these drawings. It would be a sort of brighter reddy brown brick, and then you've got a secondary brick here where there are sections of it recessed, and that's the extent of the presentation. Not got any further updates.
Okay, thank you. So any specific questions on the plans, Councillor Woodby?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted, sorry, yeah, I think you need to go forward. I just wanted to see how high the buildings that are there at the moment compared to the new building. I'm sure there was a line, but I just want to make sure of it. Sorry.
Yes, there is. If I go back to the section drawings, it is quite faint, but we have a red line on there that shows the how it relates to the.
Yeah, it was that one. Is it
one
on the left hand? Oh, I see. Is it the red line? Sorry, I was thinking it's the black and white lines.
But there
above.
There are different sections and slices through the site. So this shows building heights, but those sections are related to some of the sort of lower shed type buildings on site. But if you recall, I can go back to the photos if you want. Generally, there's the railway shed and the white clad building that are sort of in the region of 3 stories high, where they face onto the street. Or not?
No, you don't need to go back.
Okay. All right.
Okay, Councillor Merritt.
Thank you. Can I ask 2 questions? One is, what are the eating kitchen arrangements for occupants?
we haven't got, I don't think there's any floor plans as such in the presentation that show the exact layouts of the apartments, but they're all studio type rooms. So it's all self-contained within each of the studio. There's a bathroom in there, and there are kitchen facilities. We've looked at the size of the rooms and how they equate to, they're generally aligned with most of the rooms that we've approved on previous schemes. They sort of range from 20 square meters in area up to 41 square meters in area, I think it is.
Okay.
Just on that, I think we've got the architects available when we come to public participation, so you could ask that question.
Can I ask about the landscaping as well? Are those trees along the front of the development? And how practical are they if they're very near the pavement and potential services in the pavement?
We've got a condition for the detailed landscaping scheme that I think will come more later on. So there's nothing specific as to what those trees will be. As you say, there may well be issues with services, and there may well be issues with visibility displays that limit what can be done there.
Okay. No further questions on the specifics of the plans, and there's no update to the report. So it's as you've had it, which means that we can move on to the public speakers. So we have Graham Holbeck, who is here speaking in support, and then available for questions is Matt Parkins, who's the scheme architect, and Janet O'Neill as a planning consultant. So Graham, you'll have 3 minutes to address the committee. You can start in your own time, and then I'll give you a heads up if it looks like you're going to run over your 3 minutes. So on you go.
That's fine. Thank you, Chair. As we've already heard, a previous application to develop this site for 136 student bed spaces was refused at the June committee meeting last year. An appeal against that decision has been lodged with the Planning Inspectorate. However, the developer's main focus has been on amending the scheme to address the concerns raised by members. Having viewed the recording from the previous meeting, which was very helpful, I think that the main take home was that it was an accumulation of small issues that led to the decision rather than any one insurmountable hurdle. So in response to the reasons for refusal, and as Jonathan has already pointed out, we have now reduced the overall number of rooms to 133. We've provided additional communal facilities with common rooms now available on every floor. We've introduced an extra lift to the building, so there are now 2 lifts serving all 5 floors, and also increased the level of accessible parking, whereby 3 spaces are now provided, along with a designated bay for maintenance vehicles. And this followed a very constructive dialogue with highway officers after the last meeting on the appropriate level of provision. Finally, we've also submitted evidence on the viability of alternative employment uses in order to demonstrate compliance with policy EC2 of the local plan. And again, this is covered within the committee report. The other major change is that the development will now generate a policy compliant contribution towards affordable housing provision of just over £700,000. Now, speaking to the housing strategy team, I understand this could support the delivery of around 10 affordable homes in the city, which, given the current need, is a significant benefit of the revised proposal. Otherwise, the design and appearance of the proposed building is broadly identical to the previous application and is again supported by planning and design officers. The choice of materials, as Jonathan said, did not come quite accurately on the elevations, but we do have some large-scale detail sheets with us and also some photos of examples elsewhere. The building will achieve a BREEAM rating of excellent. The most important factor, though, in our view, is that this development makes an efficient use of a vacant brownfield site and will meet an established need for purpose-built student accommodation. The vast majority of PBSA is likely to come forward on windfall sites such as this one, and it'll be crucial that an effective use of land is achieved in meeting this need. This particular development is already attached to an operator, so if planning permission is granted here today, then its works are scheduled to begin on site within the next couple of months. And with this in mind, and with the changes to the scheme, we hope that members are now in a position to endorse your officer recommendation for approval. As Councillor Corso said, I do have the architect here with me, and we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was just within your 3 minutes, so spot on. Thank you. So members, any questions for the applicant? Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for those remarks. So I did want to ask a specific question that came relating to highways management. Last time, if you watch the recording, you'll remember that there were some concerns about the drop-off and pick-up situation. There was only a small area available for students to be dropped off and picked up from the university, as happens during the start and end of their term and end of their year. Page 96, section 5.39, the bottom talks about student management plan in place to try and deal with this. Could you please explain how the student management plan will work and any of the details attached to it, and how confident you feel that, you know, 133 students can be dropped off within a 48-hour period without any disruption to the area around?
Yes, of course. Well, the management plan was produced by Hello Student, who are attached to this scheme. They're a very experienced student housing operator. They've already got 2 operational schemes within the city. So it is a tried and tested model. Essentially, there's 133 bed spaces. Even working on an assumption that every one of those bed spaces requires a private vehicle to drop them off. We've looked at the timings for that. So there are 3 drop-off slots per hour for each car parking space. So that correlates to 9 drop-offs per hour. And on that basis, you could achieve all the drop-offs within a 15-hour period. So that would be achievable in one weekend. As I said, the likelihood is, though, that based on their current experience elsewhere, actually 50% of arrivals are likely to come through either the airport shuttle service, public transport or taxis. So it makes it robust in that scenario. And the other thing to factor in is that the drop-offs and collections will take place over a 10-day period, capturing 2 weekends. So when you take into account those 2 factors, we feel that it's significantly robust. I'd also mention, even though there are only 3 car parking spaces, there is also a maintenance space, which is predominantly used by the substation user if on the very rare occasion that the substation will require maintenance. So that does give you a 4th space, meaning that even with that, if they're occupied, you've still got the lane and, you know, the U-shaped lay-by available for vehicles to pass in and pass out.
Okay. Supplementary.
Brief supplementary on that. So in terms of this management plan, it would be utilising the current disabled space provision. Is that the plan you're saying? Or
during drop-offs and collections, yes.
And would it be ensured that, for example, if a disabled student were arrived first, presumably they'd want to leave their car there? Is that factored into the management?
I think that's the point. There's a degree of flexibility within the management plan, but they would have to, you know, they're experienced operators, and they would have to account for those types of scenarios. They would know prior to the drop-offs and collections taking place, the needs of the students are accommodated there, and they would have to factor that in. It is a kind of an evolutionary moving process, really. It's not fixed, it's set in stone on day one. In that, you know, if there was in subsequent years, the accommodation requirements might change, and therefore they would have to adapt the management plan.
Okay. And I understand that there is a existing provider that you've utilised to this who's worked in 2 other sites in the city.
That's right.
Are those sites similar to this in the sense they've only got 3 designated pickup spots with a 4th supplementary, or are they sites, for example, with their own car park attached?
I don't know whether, Matt, you can come in on Samuel Tuke.
Neither have associated.
If you could just pop your microphone on.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, no, they're very similar. The other site, Samuel Tuke, for example, on Lawrence Street, has very limited parking, just a small courtyard and sort of access driveway. So inevitably, these sorts of student schemes are in built-up areas with little parking. They don't have lots of parking spaces associated with them, so they manage this on almost all sites.
Thank you.
Okay, I had Councillor Wood be next.
Thank you, Chair. Just touching on a point you made, you said that 50% might come by public transport, so say taxis. Are they going to be allotted in into a time, or are they just going to turn up because then there's going to be chaos? Do you see what I'm saying? Because you will have your 3 allotted already, and then if three taxis turn up, what are you gonna do?
My understanding is that they will be allotted a time as well. Yeah.
Okay, and Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. A few questions, but I just wanted to say I'm really pleased to see that you've taken on board the things that we talked about. It's really nice to see you come back with 2 lifts. And an additional parking space, although one of my questions is, looking at the plans, it looks to me like you've got 2 compliant disabled parking spaces, and then the one additional one next to the substation is an additional parking space, but isn't going to be fully compliant in terms of back and side spacing. Is that correct?
So that,
Yeah, so.
yeah, no, it is compliant. It's so the compliant space for depicted by building regs in BS 8300 is the normal parking space with a 1200 zone on one side at the short side and one on the long sides.
Right.
So that's a compliant space. It's just on the whether the pair of spaces, it's just efficient to be able to put them in.
That's
Put
great.
that
That's really
extra
nice
space
to
in.
see. Thank you. And then just a couple of other questions. So on the report from the last time this application came, but not this time, strangely, there's a reference to cobbled sets that might or might not be popping up under the ground, and potential to retain them if there are, or reuse them. I was just wondering where that had gone, because when I was looking over the papers for the last one, I don't remember that being there, to be honest, but there's something about how there are potentially some sort of cobbled sets on site that might be able to be retained. Yeah,
Yeah, it's actually never been a part of the discussions with
Yeah.
officers that it's new to me really as well. I don't know where that's come from.
yeah, it stood out to me as a bit odd, so I just wanted to ask you about whether you were aware of that, or if you found something like that, could there be a move to retain something like that or reuse within the site?
Yeah, let's see, why not? I think if they're valuable, like sets of valuable resource, obviously we need to be careful where we use those, because they can be difficult to walk on. They're not actually very accessible, especially if they're old and well worn. So depending on what it is, it would be a valuable asset to the site if we can reuse them. Yeah.
Great. And then the other things I just wanted to ask about is in a similar vein, I suppose. There's mention of bat roosting and bird nesting and discussions about how we can make the site as kind of biodiverse as possible, and with consideration for those sorts of things. We do like to talk about swift bricks on this committee a lot and things like that. Are those things in consideration in terms of when we're building this?
Yeah, there's an ecology report submitted with the application, which
Yeah.
makes exactly those recommendations for, I can't remember exactly which species they've recommended boxes for, but that's their recommendation. Those are the recommendations, and those are what we expect to put in the building.
Okay, brilliant. And one other thing, if that's all right, Chair. There was a discussion last time, I seem to remember, about there being some sort of condition on students residing in the building about not having cars. And I just wanted to sort of ask what measures you'll be taking to ensure. I mean, I appreciate you cannot fully know via the DVLA who does and doesn't have a car, but I believe that it was mentioned that that was going to be something that was going to be a condition of tenancy in this building.
We've discussed that previously. It's very hard to impose that condition. As you say, it's very difficult to police. So, I mean, students, as I understand it, will be notified that there is no car parking available, and, told not to bring a car to the site. But how you actually police that in practice, as with any residential or student development, is quite difficult. Just going back to your comment on the cobble set, so there is a condition on archaeology, and we would have to make our way through the steps of that condition. So if something was, observed of value, that's something that we would look into.
How firm do you think the firmest is that you can be about car ownership or students bringing cars? Is it just to advise them not to, or is there anything stronger that you can do as a student accommodation thing? That's a genuine question.
Yeah, it's apologies. It's quite a difficult one to answer for us. We're obviously not the operator, but they would certainly be advised that there's no car parking facilities on site.
I think possibly the takeaway on that is possibly just to invite the applicant to feed back to the operator that there are concerns, I think, around spillover with people, not just at this location, but in this vicinity, that are parking in side streets, which is obviously impacting on the local residents. And so anything that can be done to seek to mitigate that will obviously be very much welcome, just in the interest of the wider community cohesion. So if that can be fed back to the operator, for them to take any steps that they can, should this be approved, I think that would be welcome.
Absolutely, I'm sure they'll be watching, so.
I'm not seeing, oh, I am seeing several more hands. That's excellent. I have also got a question, but I'll invite my colleagues to see if they can ask it first. So I think I saw all three of you at once. So Councillor Kelly first, and then Councillor Merritt, and Councillor Whitcroft, you had another one as well.
Thank you. One of the things that we raised last time was the size of the rooms. And I know that you just mentioned that you've reduced the number of total rooms, but I think that extra space seems to have gone to the communal areas. And I know in the report that you mentioned that you've kind of compared the size of the rooms to the guidance in other cities like Leeds. But I just wanted clarity that you hadn't reduced the size or hadn't made the size of the rooms bigger, and kind of like to understand a bit more about your thinking behind that decision.
Yes, the size of the rooms hasn't been reduced. It's the same as was presented to the committee last time round. So the minimum studio size is 20 square meters. I think there was a little bit of uncertainty last time. I wasn't at the meeting, but I've obviously reviewed the recording. They were quoting 19 square meters last time around. That wasn't actually the case. It has always been 20 square meters to 41, I think, is the largest room. So it's always been in that range. So perhaps it's an increase in what was reported, but it's not an increase in what was on the floor plans. Yeah.
I'll just join in briefly just to say that 20 square meters is the minimum size. 40% of the rooms are bigger than that. So there's a variety.
Okay, Councillor Merritt was next.
Yes, can I ask the two questions I asked earlier again in terms of how those room sizes work in terms of being able to cook and eat if there's no separate eating accommodation and kitchen accommodation. And secondly, in terms of the practicality of the tree arrangements along the front, it does look a fairly narrow strip. Is there going, A, the issue of services, B, the issue of is there enough space for route development, issue, avoiding compaction from the traffic that's coming in and out, and the splays issue that was flagged as well.
So to answer the first question, all the rooms are self-contained studios, so they have kitchenette facilities within each studio. Everybody has their own kitchenette. And in actual fact, this operator, it might be aren't seen on that plan. This operator does actually provide, as part of that communal space, what they call a private dining room, so students can get together and eat together if they want to. That's part of that communal facility. As far as the trees are concerned, there is it's not I was going to say a detailed landscape plan. It's fairly detailed landscape plans with suggested species and proposals for those trees. And your point was raised by the highway officers about the impact on services in the footway, and as part of the submission, there is a detail showing the tree protection, route protection along the boundary. So the landscape architect has considered the area that they're going to be planted in and the type of tree that's going to be planted in that zone. They're not just green blobs that we've stuck on. It's been thought through by a landscape architect.
Thank you.
Okay,
Had Councillor Whitcroft next. Oh, is that a supplementary, Councillor?
Yeah,
Okay.
just I was just it did surprise me that there wasn't the studio layout in the current report, but I just thought it was worth mentioning in the previous reports there is that layout of what the rooms look like, and I just thought it might be useful if that's still exactly the same, if that might be something that could be shared up there with members.
We'll see if we can find that whilst Councillor Whitcroft is asking his question.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to see that there's a Section 106 agreement attached to this report, providing funding for affordable housing. Of course, that will be off-site. I understand that there is no obligation to ensure affordable housing on this site. But I would just like to sort of raise the question if there's any view to understand the implications of the guidance we set in other developments around affordability for this particular development. Student housing is not exempt from rising costs and not exempt from increasing rents, and can often cost a lot more than other private accommodation. I just don't know whether there's any view, it might be a case of feedback and things like that, to examine whether there could be steps taken to ensure affordability, or perhaps housing earmarked for particular bursary students or something like that. I'm just concerned about housing affordability, and my concern doesn't end at students. I think that they also deserve similar consideration. So if you could talk a bit about affordability on site, or if there's any effort that you consider making on that perspective.
As members probably know, that we act for both universities in the city. The University of York has on-campus housing, York St John doesn't, but what York St John does have is off-campus blocks like St John's Central at Stonebow, but also has block rentings of HMOs, not out of choice, but because that's what they can get for the students. But as part of our representations on the SIL public consultation, the community infrastructure levy, which the council is preparing at the moment and will impose on development once the local plan's adopted. We looked at the level at which each university is subsidising student housing, and it's a lot of money. University of York is between £5 and £6 million a year, so that if students have a need, they can apply. So rather than having specific rooms that are for students from, say, a low-income family, sorry, St John's also provide bursaries for student rent. But rather than having specific rooms, which would be difficult because you don't know who's coming in any year, the students can apply, and the serious funding goes into reducing student rents. But students, it's very expensive being a student these days, and that's one of the difficulties. But these schemes like this one, which isn't attached to either university, it is really a market forces issue. But as I say, they go to the university and ask for subsidy if they can't afford it.
I think the general principle, I think, is when we're making the Section 106 agreements, the first preference is always for affordable to be delivered on site in any development of any sort. Obviously, each different development has a different set of particular things around it where it is or isn't available. And I think the fact that there is a 106 agreement that has got an affordable housing commuted sum is obviously the ideal is to have it on site, but the second best is to make sure that we've got the appropriate level of commuted sum. And I think in this particular situation, obviously that dialogue has taken place, and that's been the position that's been arrived at, which is, I think, different than it was on the previous application, which I think is, obviously something to take into account when we're considering the overall planning balance on this. I think we have got the picture that we were looking for. We're just working out to get that up on screen. I'm just going to ask a quick question just to do with the communal. Apologies, I will bring you in, Councillor Vendor, but I'll jump in for the minute. So obviously there's now communal space dotted throughout the building, which I think is a positive. On the first floor, so this is in my report, it's page 126, and there's a sort of what I think was originally 3 rooms that have been essentially sort of knocked through into a communal space, but leaving the sort of stubs of the walls there. And I wasn't sure whether that was a structural need or a sort of design feature or because it struck me as looking a little bit odd, but there may be good reason for it. So I just wanted to understand that a little bit more, really.
Yeah, it's at the moment that the way we currently expect the construction strategy to work, those help with structural strategy because of the rooms above. We've got rooms above that are those proportions, and so they're just load paths for the walls directly above.
So I suppose my then question really was just to make sure that some thought goes into how that space is an appropriate communal space to use and not just a kind of a awkward space that nobody really can use in the way that it's intended.
Yeah, absolutely. This particular operator produces very high quality interiors. They're very keen on making sure their internal environments, particularly the communal environments, are they're hotel-like, really. They're very high quality.
Okay, Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. The last time we considered the application, there was a discussion around loss of employment land. And I've sort of read the report this time round, which I think does run through the issues and concludes that there is no realistic prospect of the land coming back into use. I just wondered whether anything had changed since this was considered last year in terms of any expressions of interest that may have come along. I suppose it's really just to assure ourselves that there isn't another potential use hasn't appeared in the interim that would cause us to revisit that discussion. I'm not suggesting we do, but it'd be helpful to have any further information as to whether there has been any further expressions of interest in the retention of the site for employment.
I'm not aware of any expressions of interest. They wouldn't come to me if anybody was interested, but obviously we liaise with the developer on a regular basis and the landowner, and we've not been made aware of any of those expressions of interest. The thing that's changed in terms of demonstrating compliance with that policy is we've now submitted a statement just to show, to demonstrate a more robust case in terms of complying with the requirements of the 2 criteria of EC2, which I think was probably a little bit lacking from the previous submission.
Okay, Councillor Merritt, I think you had another question.
Yeah, also relates to the same issue. I know in the past it may not be current practice, but normally there was an expectation that for commercial sites, the site had been demonstrably marketed to prove whether there was demand or not. Was that done in this case?
I think that was the question that was raised at the previous planning committee. There hasn't been any further marketing exercise since that time. What we have done is we've tested various different development scenarios to look at the viability of alternative employment uses, so the traditional B use classes. We've used the evidence within the council's the evidence base for the council's SIL charging schedule makes assumptions on things like developable area, build costs, projected yields. And we've looked at the assumptions that have been made for a site such as this and an edge of centre location and put them into a viability model. And the outcome was that those traditional B class use classes would not be a viable prospect on this particular site. There's a number of reasons, but there are quite a few constraints to this site as an employment location. It's a long, thin site. It fronts onto a busy section of the inner ring road, which carries challenges in terms of access and manoeuvrability once you get on site for service vehicles. It's surrounded by housing on 2 sides, which limits potential bad neighbour uses. It's also, with its edge of centre location, it's not particularly desirable as an office location, or indeed would fetch the highest rents. And those all contributed to the viability issue. Fortunately, those constraints don't apply in the same way to PBSA, and in some ways that makes it a very nice fit for that particular need.
Sorry, you referred to the previous hearing. I wasn't present for that particular application. Were you saying that, were you implying that it had been marketed before it came last time?
Sorry, I also wasn't present at the previous meeting, but I have viewed the recording. No, the conversation at the previous meeting, the same question was asked about the marketing of the property. At the time, the applicant was, you know, an 18-month marketing exercise hadn't been undertaken. The site was marketed by the previous owner, and the offers and the bids came forward from developers interested in, you know, putting the site forward for student accommodation or housing development.
Okay, councillor Steels-Walshaw.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. Sorry, it might be going back a bit to something we discussed before, but it was about the start date, which you said would be in about 8 weeks. Did you say you'd be about ready to start? I just wanted to ask a question because there's a thing on the nesting birds that between March and August, you can't do any demolition or vegetation clearance unless the ecologist's undertaken the detailed work. I just wondered if that had happened or if that could push it back to kind of a September start. Just wondered.
I don't think there's a significant nesting bird issue. There's only a limited degree of vegetation on the site. That is the ambition. I mean, 8 weeks might be a little bit ambitious. There's a few conditions to sign off before then, but I think it is an accelerated construction programme because these schemes are all based around student intake. So if you miss a month, you lose a year, and so it will. 8 weeks might be ambitious, but certainly we'll be looking to start on site and certainly before summer, I would have thought. Have you got anything to add on?
Sorry, contradict you slightly there. It's likely to be after the summer before we start on site, the demolitions and things, but we're absolutely conscious of what the ecology requirements are and the recommendation that if we're not outside of all of the sensitive periods, then there'll be an ecologist on site to make sure that all that's done in nothing's done to disturb the. It has been surveyed, but it'll need to be resurveyed if we're going to do works within those periods. So I think that's taken care of in the proposed conditions.
Thank you.
Right, after quite a lot of plugging and unplugging and searching and frantic things, we have found the plans for the rooms. So if you look over my shoulder, you can see them, and I hope that they're self-explanatory, and if there are any questions on the specifics of the rooms, we've gone to a lot of effort to get them up there for you. So
Can we confirm that this is still relevant?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. Any further questions from members? No. The one other last question I had, and I don't know whether it's possible for you to describe or not, the accessible rooms, and it's very much welcome that the point around the lift has been taken on board. I think the other point that was raised was just around the proximity to the lift of the accessible rooms that are above the ground floor. And I wasn't able to work out from the plans how far they are from the lifts in each location. You may or may not be able to tell me if you're not, but the bit of feedback again to the operator would be that obviously accessible rooms need to be close to the lifts in order for them to be genuinely accessible. So if you can tell us that they are, that's great. And if not, if that can be fed back in, I think that's important.
Well, absolutely. We'll feed that back to the operator. They are distributed around. I can't give you the actual dimensions, how far away they are. They are distributed around the floor plate because the building regulation. So the access means of access and for disabled people is dealt with in the building regulations, which refers to the British standards, and that has a requirement that these rooms are distributed around the building so that they have a variety of. They're not all don't have all the single outlook, and they've got a choice of places that rooms that they can select. So they're spread around for that reason, which does mean they're not all clustered around the lift shaft. Of course, different people have different requirements. those who have really are restricted in movement, you know, have movement difficulties, then they could select rooms which are closer to the lifts.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Is this a supplementary on that? Okay, Councillor Nelson, and then I have Councillor Fenton,
I just
and then I
wanted
think we're about there.
to point out, because I think that part of the issue is that the text is very, very small. The accessible studios, like on the plan that we're looking at there, one of them is right behind the lifts. They seem to be in the kind of corner areas. So you've got one on each floor, my understanding is right next to the lift, and one on each floor at the opposite kind of corner, but along the same corridor that the lifts are on when I've been looking at them.
Thank you. And Councillor Fenton.
I'll be told if this is not an appropriate question, but I'll ask it anyway. Obviously, there is an appeal in train in relation to the initial refused application. So are you able to give an indication as to?
I think that might be an inappropriate question. I think we have to deal with this application on its own merits without any thought to anything else that may or may not be happening to do with the previous application. Councillor Merritt.
Can I ask, is this application linked specifically to York St John University or the main university?
No. The intention of the council is to have nomination agreements on student housing, but at the moment that is not the situation with this application until that comes in.
Okay, I think that is us exhausted of questions. There's been quite a few actually here this afternoon, so thank you very much for your time. If you want to sit back in the public gallery and obviously watch the remainder of the session. Members, if you have any questions now for officers on any specific details and the report. I saw Councillor Nelson first and then I saw Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Question to you in the same way that we just asked the applicants. In terms of the employment land viability assessment that's been submitted, are you totally happy that that makes this policy compliant for the EC? I think it's policy EC2, I'll write it somewhere. EC2, yeah.
I think we feel it's each case on its own merits, and we feel like we have enough information here to justify the change of use and the loss of the employment land. As the applicants say, they've put forward a case to us that explain the viability issues with continued employment use of the site, and that's consistent with our own council's evidence base. And there are evidently question marks and potential issues about, because there's residential on two sides of the site, if it was to restart up as an employment site, there could well be issues with neighbours if it was industrial type processes. Other employment uses, maybe a hotel or similar to that, which we'd be looking at similar effects. So we feel like they've provided enough information to justify the loss of this particular employment site. There is also the MPPF policy, which tells us how much weight to give to different items. And as we'd always say, it's each case on its own merits, but the thrust of the national policy is to give more weight to housing provision compared to employment land. So we'd have to go the extra distance to sort of fight over the employment land if we want to keep it. And given that the issues that we have with this particular site, we're happy that in the round the housing, there's more benefits in the scheme than there are from losing the employment land. There's also the case that the local plan in its allocations allocates enough land to meet what's expected to be future needs. And it is written into the plan that has extra allocations because it's anticipated there will be situations like this where we lose employment land. So in the round, we're happy that the employment land is not a reason for refusal.
Thank you. Can I ask one other question? Because my only other question is, I can't remember if we asked this last time. Can we condition something around car ownership or informative? Is there anything we can do through this process to encourage the operators to at least request that students don't bring cars to the site?
the problems we have around it are the enforceability, and the onus falls on us at the end of the day. But what we tend to see with these, it's usually written into the tenancy agreements on these purpose-built ones that students are told that they can't bring cars and there isn't any car parking provision. And the other element to it is, in our experience, when we have these purpose-built ones in and around the city centre, we do always have conditions for travel plans. And what comes with that is there are surveys done each year when they're in operation. And the surveys do tend to show that students don't own cars and they're always walking. So the evidence isn't necessarily there on these particular city centre sites that it's an issue. It might be a different typology in a different neighbourhood, but with these ones, we don't feel that there's enough there. So hopefully that
I do completely understand, and I remember this conversation happening to one extent or another before. I guess that's kind of where I'm confused, because you know, if it's quite usual practice for it to be written into tenancy agreements, then I suppose, is that something that we can request to be written into tenancy agreements, which is normal practice anyway, or is it just not worth?
I think what we have to just hold in mind with any condition is that they've always got to be reasonable, proportionate and enforceable. And it's whether or not you can meet all three of those tests. I think we have requested specifically that the applicant considers that and feeds that back to the operator. I think the advice from officers is consistently been that it's very, very difficult to enforce those sort of things. And so therefore it's difficult to meet the tests of whether it's reasonable to put that condition in. Hopefully it's a message that's being heard loud and clear. But I think the information that I've certainly had when I've tested that has been that it's very difficult to put that sort of thing into a condition.
Fine, absolutely fine, thank you.
So I've got a few people with hands. So the order I've got is Councillor Stewart next, then I think Councillor Merritt, you had your hand, and then Councillor Whitcroft.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's back to the point about the evidence of there not being a demand for employment land, and I would, you know, I'm relaxed about that. I think from the point of view of what's in the officer report, we'll get a very, very clear steer on it, and also the way we can walk around York and we can see such sites available. However, the planning consultant accurately said that, you know, it was quite a few things that tipped the balance for refusal last time. And my recollection is that I thought that putting in the employment land aspect was quite strong as one of the grounds for refusal, because I seem to recall that we then set a particular term for which it must be marketed and a particular time frame which wouldn't have expired by now. Have I misremembered that?
Yeah, I think this is me trying to recall from July last year. I think there was the 18 months was discussed, but I don't think the reason for refusal, I'm gonna just double check it, didn't specifically say that it had to be done for that amount of time. And then they have come back with further information in terms of the loss of the employment land. So we've made a judgment on that basis. I think it was the 18 months, but I don't think it went specifically into the reason for refusal. Give me a second while I double check, but that's the reasoning how we've got to where we have.
I'm quite the text that we have in 1.8 with the 2 bullet points is essentially pulls out what the main reasons for refusal were last time round. So it was around insufficient information about compliance with the policy EC2, but the reason for refusal itself didn't explicitly set out that meant 18 months marketing would be necessary, and that's not what the policy asks for either. It refers to it as being an example of a reasonable marketing period, but it's not the only way of complying with the policy.
My recollection, I think we did discuss around the marketing, and I think we did it in the context of saying, has this met the policy EC2? And I think that we then said we haven't seen enough evidence that EC2 has been met, rather than we haven't seen that it's been marketed or not marketed for this specific time. Because I think the way that we discussed it was there were a number of tests of EC2, one of which was around the length of time that it's marketed, because we've certainly had that conversation in this committee before around appropriate length of time of marketing. I guess as a committee, when we come to debate, one of the things that we have to weigh is whether we feel that we've got now sufficient information to say that policy EC2 has been met. I don't know whether we have the specific wording of that policy, or if not, if we can perhaps just be bringing it up so that members can see what the policy says, to see whether we feel that we've got the sufficient information to have met that policy. Does that satisfy in terms of your recollection as well?
I mean, my concern is potentially that we could be in a position where we are happy there is not the alternative demand for employment land, but past conversations of the committee, which admittedly haven't translated into a recommendation for refusal in July, specifying an 18-month period, may mean that's an issue, because we did talk about it and we did talk about the marketing aspect, rightly or wrongly, and if there hasn't been any further marketing at all, then I think that for me does cause issues in terms of the committee's decision making, and I did think that at the time when that was sort of put in as one of the reasons. So that remains a concern, even though I do believe that this site can't be employment land for a number of reasons. I think it is only going one way, but I'm just thinking I don't see that that's particularly changed since July, and the comments and decisions the committee came to in July would then need a basis for why they're different now. And I think where you've got all the other aspects that have changed in terms of disabled spaces, size of rooms, communal areas, there hasn't for me been a change on that July point. So
yeah, I understand the point you're making. I think have we got the wording of the policy just for members to hold in mind? And I suppose ultimately the consideration will have to be, do we consider it that policy is, we've got enough information to say it's met or not met? And if we feel that it is or isn't met, is that sufficient to sway people's overall balance in the overall picture? Because I think, again, the original decision wasn't just based on one policy, it was based on a number of points.
I'm going to have to read it to you because I daren't mess with that again. Okay. So policy EC2, loss of employment. When considering proposals which involve the loss of land and or buildings which are either identified, currently used, or were last used for employment uses, the council will expect developers to provide a statement to the satisfaction of the council demonstrating that 1, the existing land and or buildings are demonstrably not viable in terms of market attractiveness, business operations, condition and or compatibility with adjacent uses, and 2, the proposal would not lead to the loss of an employment site that is necessary to meet employment needs during the planned period. That's what the policy says. The explanation that goes with it, said 4.9, when considering the loss of employment land and or buildings, the council will expect the applicant to provide evidence proportionate to the size of the site, effective marketing of the site premises for employment uses for a reasonable period of time, and in most cases, not less than 18 months. And it goes on, but that's the bit that you were wanting. And in most cases, not less than 18 months. So it doesn't say it has to be done in every case. Okay.
Councillor Stewart.
yeah, I think the fact that it says, as you say, in most cases, makes our life vastly easier. So.
Okay, thank you. So next I had Councillor Merritt.
It's in regard to paragraph 5.4 and policy H7, which says that proposals for new student accommodation should demonstrate a need for student housing that cannot be met on campus. The papers obviously identify that there is a need for student housing, but the papers at the moment don't appear to demonstrate that they cannot be met on campus. I'm not up to date on the situation with the university's East Campus and whether they have now rolled out or the student accommodation that was envisaged there, or and therefore whether there, as the plan implies, there's still the opportunity to provide the additional purpose-built student accommodation on campus.
I think we don't, the policy, we're having to assess the application sort of today against the present scenario. So I don't think we have the data or could have the influence over the data. We can show you what the need is and what the supply is as of today, but it's not possible for us to understand how the university may or may not grow in future and what student provision may or may not be on campus in a development management perspective. We're only able to look at sort of the current supply and demand.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the planning permission for the East Campus requires universities to submit a statement each year about the student numbers, existing accommodation and the pressures.
I don't think we haven't got that to hand with us now, and I think what Jonathan is saying is we have to base this application on the information we have in this application and what we have in front of us in terms of what we know from the strategic housing market assessment. And on that, we've made a balanced view, given the weight of the policies and the information we have in front of us is how we've made the balance of getting to the recommendation we have.
We assess these in consultation with our local plans team who look at them, and they've never seen it as a necessary thing for anyone to explicitly set out what the university is doing essentially in terms of meeting the accommodation needs. Our advice has always been is that it's an assessment on the situation at the moment.
Well, with respect, that's not correct. Because when I was involved in the previous administration, we had exactly this issue, and we were on the basis of the information supplied, we were applied pressure to the university to develop two further student accommodation units to address the shortfall that they had at that time, and that led to planning applications coming forward from the university to do exactly that. And that was around 2013.
Well, thank you, Chair. Could you confirm, because my understanding is that the East Campus is now built out as far as the planning permission and the leasing conditions allow. Is that correct or not? Because I understand that they were out to build, I think, 4 more colleges on there, and they've all now been built and are about to be occupied.
Yeah, from the information I have, no, it isn't. There's still further phases to come forward on that. Jonathan, yeah.
So I think that the way that we perhaps have to deal with this today is not necessarily the same as what we might want to do going forward, particularly if we move to a point where the local plan is adopted, because obviously local policy H7 is a local plan policy. So as we stand at the moment, I don't know whether that's moderate weight that's applied to that or more than moderate weight, but there is a limitation to the weight that we can apply to a local plan policy as it stands today. But obviously those policies become more and more and more weight as we go forward. If that information is being submitted to the local authority and is available, then I think it's absolutely right that that information should be included within reports around this sort of thing. If the point of the policy is to take a measured approach to how we're managing student accommodation, then that needs to be being included, and we as a committee need to be aware of it. I think, again, when we come to debate, I'll invite members to consider within the balance of the round where we feel that things are, and we just need to be careful and aware of how much weight we can and can't apply to what policies at what stage. And we have the application that we have before us with the information that we have before us, and we have to determine that we're satisfied or otherwise to make a determination based on what's here with us today, because I unfortunately don't think we're going to be able to get that information during this particular session. So I think in essence, it is what it is, but I think it's certainly something that we perhaps want to come back to if should future applications for this type of accommodation be coming forward, just so we're clear as a committee that we have got all the information that we need to make those determinations. So Is this a supplementary on this? So I've got, was this a supplementary, Councillor Stewart, and then I've got Councillor Whitcroft and then Councillor Nelson.
Yeah, not wanting to move into debate. However, for me, this sort of issue does blow a flaw in the council's student housing policy, because surely in this sort of case they're appealing to both universities. Unless that is the case, isn't it? They're appealing to both universities. So how on earth can you possibly say it should be built on campus when one year they might have 93% of people at York St John and 7% at University of York, and the next year it might be the reverse? To exaggerate, but we can't possibly say it should be on campus if we don't know which campus it relates to. So it's an inherent flaw in the council's housing policy, as far as I'm concerned.
So not having been an author of said policy, I won't take that as something that's for a criticism of myself or us. It's a point to note. But again, I think I'd refer you back to, when we come to debate, this is something that we'll need to have in consideration. And obviously, the local plan is at the stage that it's at, and the policies are at the stage that they're at. There are points for review along the way, aren't there? Councillor Whitcroft.
Yeah, just to be clear, this wasn't a supplementary to this point. It's a new question. Two, in fact, just related to, so page 92 at the top, section 5.19. There is the mention of applicants referring to the Leeds Council's supplementary planning guidance. I just want to be sure, is that supplementary planning guidance related just to student accommodation, or is that supplementary planning guidance for anywhere there are rooms, so a block of flats, for example? And also, I think, is there any consideration for, or is there any precedent rather for using Leeds's council, Leeds Council's guidance? Because given that I think it might be a case for us to get our own one, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, just yeah, thank you.
The answer to that is it's Leeds supplementary planning guidance, so I don't know. Okay. I don't know, because I don't know theirs the way that I would know ours. I think it's more that they're trying to illustrate that that's a baseline that is seen in Leeds. That's quite a lot of universities, and I think it's more of that we're trying to give a benchmark than anything else, but I can't comment on the rest of it.
Okay, and Councillor Nelson,
I
supplementary on this.
It's relevant to this because I actually can answer that, because I believe, well, it's possible that the reason that it's mentioned is in the meeting where the first version of this application came forward. It was something that I'd looked at, because York doesn't have a minimum space requirement. So it was something that came up in the discussion, which is probably why it's referenced in the papers, because it was discussed at the previous meeting. And I was looking at it earlier today. And that particular section is about student accommodation specifically. Although there are, if you're interested in Leeds, as supplementary planning documents, minimum sizes for all sorts of things.
Okay, Councillor Whitcroft, I think you had a second question.
Yes, that was just related to regarding the section 106 money. I see we're getting, sorry, it's on page 99, section 9, yes, page 97, section 7, sorry. Page 99, section 7, apologies. In terms of the off-site affordable housing that's delivered, in what format will that necessarily take? So is that the case that it is all just put towards a wider affordable housing pot, or have there been agreements? It was mentioned there will now be able to provide 7 affordable houses. Will that be 7 on their own, or are there any conditions that, or can the council essentially use that for affordability in any capacity that they see fit?
It would go over to the housing delivery and the housing team at the council, who would put it to the best use that they see fit. But it's not specific to any type of affordable housing. That would be their decision to make.
Okay, next was Councillor Nelson.
Thank you. Bit of an odd one, really. I was wondering, so in the external consultants section, page 87, there's a section from the Victorian Society about the Station Master's house. But what confused me was they weren't consulted, or they didn't have a comment the first time this application came. So I was just kind of wondering how that had come about. And equally, I noticed, so that's mentioned by the York Civic Society as well. But when you look back at the previous version of this application, although the York Civic York Civic Trust, sorry, did have an objection, again, they didn't mention that heritage asset at all. So I just wondered if officers had any idea why this has sort of popped up in the papers when it's not really been mentioned previously, and whether we can really consider it when we've already looked at this application once and it's not been mentioned.
The York Civic Trust, they're not a statutory consultee as such, but that they refer to the weekly list of planning applications that we put out. So it's up to them at their discretion as to which applications they comment on. So it's hard to understand why they've come forward with it as an objection in this particular case. But
the Victorian Society, though, is listed as an external consultee, which means that I assume the council has gone for consultation with them as part of this.
Yes,
which they weren't before.
I'm not sure why we've done that differently. The officer who did that is not here. But they wouldn't be they're a statutory consultee essentially when grade 1 and grade 2 star listed buildings are involved, or if we've got substantial demolition of grade 2. So they're not a statutory consultee. So I'm not sure why we did consult the amenity societies, but the comments they've made comments as part of the public consultation process. So they are material considerations, and it's information that members do need to take into account because.
Is that even if those comments weren't made previously? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? Not seeing any further questions, so I can move us then into debate. So just to remind members, this is the opportunity to talk through any points of the plans. I'm not particularly looking for a recommendation at this stage, but you can indicate which way you may be feeling. And if I can just remind you that if somebody else has made lots of brilliant points, you can just say, I agree with them. You don't need to repeat all of those same brilliant points. But over to members to make any comments that they wish to. Councillor Merritt.
First of all, I'll pick up Councillor Stewart's point because that was obviously an important point. If you look at policy H7 in full, proposals for new off-campus purpose-built student accommodation other than the allocation of SH1 will be permitted where all the following criteria are satisfied. And criteria 2A, the rooms in the development are secured through a nomination agreement for occupation by students of one or more of the University of York and York St John. So there should be a nomination agreement in place, which we've been told by the applicant there isn't. Part of the purpose of that is so that you can deal with this situation of the different differential demands at the different universities. So if there was a nomination agreement for St John's and St John's is short of on-site accommodation, it gets the tick. If it's for University of York and they haven't met the opportunities to build on the East Campus, then the answers are no. And it's an important policy. That policy has been in place in various forms through successive versions of the local plan in order to try and protect ordinary residential accommodation in this city from the pressures from major expansion of the universities. And I'm disappointed that it appears to have sort of lapsed in terms of enforcement in the last decades while I was off the council. But yeah, we know the consequence. We have driven out large sections of the population under the age 55 bracket in the last decade because there has been such an uncontrolled expansion of the universities without them providing the requisite amount of accommodation. And it's something, you know, that is important that the local plan is seeking to address. And I'm very disappointed that the recommendations in this report haven't properly taken cognizance of that fundamental part of the local plan in terms of housing accommodation for both students and for ordinary residents. So I'd like to suggest that we actually ought to be deferring this item so that a proper assessment against the requirements of policy H7 is done. Also give the applicants an opportunity to sort out appropriate nomination agreements so that we can actually deal with this in the light of the policies that we have.
So what I will just make clear to members, just for consistency, obviously the protocol is that we will debate, we will then test the officer recommendation. If the officer recommendation falls, then there is an opportunity to look at alternative ways of dealing with the application. But the protocol is clear that we test the officer recommendation first. So at this moment in time, I'm not seeking proposals for action. I'm just seeking comment and thoughts on the application. And we will then test the recommendation in light of that. Becky, I think you just wanted to make a comment about the weight that can and can't be applied to policy.
So in terms of the policy that's been specifically outlined there, we have to be clear at this moment in time where the local plan process is, and because of the number of outstanding objections to that policy, and there is quite a lot of significant objections to that policy, we can only afford it very limited weight at this moment in time. And given that, that's how we've made the assessment that we have. We can't give that policy any form of significant weight because of the the weight of the outstanding objections that we have to that policy. That's how we have got to the recommendation that we have. It's not that we're ignoring it. We are not. We are giving it the weight that we can at this point in the process.
Okay, so I think, again, from members' point of view, we take advice from officers, we consider how we want to interpret and use that advice. We make a balanced judgment based on all of the information that we have that's before us. I had Councillor Fenton indicated wanted to speak first. Councillor Stewart, is this a comment on this particular thing? Okay, so Councillor Fenton first.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's encouraging to see the amendments that have been made to this scheme since the initial refusal, in terms of additional communal space, in terms of the second lift and the additional accessible parking space. So they're all, I think, benefits. I think I'm assured that on the point of the loss of employment land, that opportunities and avenues have been, realistic opportunities have been considered, and this is an appropriate and I think sensible use of this land. We know that there is a demand for bespoke student housing. We know that the pressures that arise from conversion of family homes into HMOs. So I'm certainly convinced of the need for this type of accommodation, and I'm pleased that comments from the previous committee have been taken on board. So I can see no sound basis on which I would go against the officer recommendation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to go around in the order that I've got. So I've got Councillor Stewart next. I've then got Councillor Nelson, Councillor Fisher, Councillor Wardby.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's always interesting to hear from Councillor Merritt. I have to say that local plan wise, if ever I criticise anything about the local plan, I've sat on my fair share of meetings and read my fair share of documents. So I'll take as much of the blame as anybody if something's not right. But I do think you know, the point the officers have made about the limited weight, I think is valid. And I think for me, what's also all the more valid is the fact that in previous applications in the last few years, student housing applications have come to this council and been okayed. I've had no part of them. And for me, I think that's the sort of relevant thing why it would be very difficult to reject this at this stage. So for me, my sort of thoughts are that we sit on any planning application and we have a presumption in favour of approval, but I was one that voted against at the July meeting for a number of reasons. And I do think these have broadly been addressed. I think the planning consultant summed it up quite well as, a number of sort of things that have been dealt with on the, the slight reduction in the number of rooms, the amenity areas have been addressed, disabled spaces, and other things. I think and the lifts as well. I think general improvements. So for me, I think that they've definitely done enough. I think on the employment land, I can't see what else it could be. I think as Jonathan said, it's very hard to see us going back into employment land with the residential either side. Nobody would want to have an office there, and you're not going to have a meat processing plant next to the residential things. It's very difficult to see where it fits in. So I would very much come down or be leaning towards, shall we say, the approval and going with the officer's recommendation. And just on that, and probably going further than you might like, Chair, on the discussion at this stage, if we were to be approving, I would be approving as per the officer recommendation, and I wouldn't be tempted to add in lots of other conditions that I think would go beyond what we could reasonably expect and what, for me, a student room operator would ordinarily do anyway. So that's where I would be leaning.
Okay, thank you. Next was Councillor Nelson.
Thank you. I would second sort of comments made by Councillor Fenton and Councillor Stewart on this. I remember this being, obviously this was recommended for approval last time, and I feel like it was really on a knife edge. And I remember a comment being made that was, if it was one more lift and another parking space, then it might have swayed it one way, but actually with the room sizes and not quite the communal space, it was down to those kind of things. It seems to me that it was refused on two very specific points, and those points have been addressed as far as I'm concerned. I don't think really, in terms of the kind of the precedent that we're dealing with here, that it's really, there's a lot of room for us to suddenly start adding totally different points that weren't within that specific refusal anyway. So I think we really have to look at what are those two specific points that it was refused on, because according to what happened last time, everything else was okay. It was those two things that needed addressing, and I do feel like they've been addressed. And I'm really pleased to see that, really. And your comments about weight in terms of the local plan policies as well, I think we need to take that into account.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Fisher next.
Chair, the agent made a very valid point that there was no single reason why we refused it last time. It was the accumulation of small reasons. Now, the great news for me is that the applicants have actually listened to what we said, and what they've come up with is a far better scheme. It will be far more livable in for the students, have far better common room space. It'll be far easier for them to get up and down, because I know from my son's moving into Joseph Stone's house in Leeds, it's the number of lifts on a multi-storey building that determines how quickly you can get in and students in and out. It's not about drop-off spaces necessarily, because it's getting people into the rooms. So the second lift is critical. The common room space will add enormously to their environment and be much, much better. We've been through the loss of employment land on previous sites. There was, I think, a plum-based site, the one on James Street, just round the corner, the car repair. Yeah, we concluded in each case there was sufficient employment land allocated in the local plan to compensate for those sites, and therefore this is an appropriate use, in my view, directly between the two universities, so both universities can access it. I'm now comfortable with it, and I shall vote in favour of it.
Thank you. Councillor Woodby.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to do exactly what you said. I agree with the points of Councillor Fenton, Councillor Stewart, Councillor Nelson and Councillor Fisher. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Councillor Whitcroft.
No such luck with me, Chair. I do know, I found myself slightly sort of torn on this one way or the other. I do remember very well the last meeting, in particular, the issues raised around parking and the provision for drop-offs and pickups. I do think that this application has brought in a number of things that have mitigated that, and I'm very pleased just generally with the idea that we've had a positive response and our amendments have been taken on board and something else to come back to it. Also pleased to see 700,000 allocated for affordable housing, but I don't discount Councillor Merritt's points regarding the idea that a lot of those areas, I'm very familiar with those areas, where it feels like the encroachment in student areas may necessarily lead to a discouragement of or declining of the enjoyment of local people living there. However, at the same time, I accept Councillor Fenton's view that if we don't build more purpose-built student accommodation, then a lot of the houses just become HMOs anyway, which would compound the problem. I don't want to let the good be an enemy or the great be an enemy of the good on this, as the saying goes. I'm still got a bit of my mind to make up, but I'm much more in favour of this application than I remember my first ever planning committee, which was when this application came forward. So yeah, just a few thoughts there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you. I also agree with the consensus so far, so I'm not going to repeat what's already been said, but I did just want to emphasise what Councillor Fenton touched on about the need for more student housing. I think 2 years ago we saw students being placed in Hull and Leeds because we literally run out of student housing, so I think there is a definite need for it there.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any further hands for any more points, and like Councillor Woodby, I'm going to just agree with many of the points that have been said rather than taking any further time. So I'm now looking to test the officer recommendation on this application. Looking for anybody who's willing to move and or second. So Councillor Fisher first.
I'll move approval with the officer recommendation.
And I did see Councillor Stewart first, but between the two of you, whoever wants to second is, I'll take Councillor Stewart as having seconded then. So Becky, if you could just talk us through what's been moved and seconded.
Okay, so the recommendation is for approval as set out in the case officer's report. There are no further amendments to any of the conditions, but it is a delegated approval to myself in terms of the section 106 agreement as outlined. Just 2 seconds, I'm just going to get my in here. I told you about limited weight in terms of H7. That was regard to the student need and the on-campus information. That wasn't towards contributions. The expectation is, and I'm putting this out there, the expectation is that if there is student accommodation, we have the evidence base to ask for the affordable housing contributions. So that's just my clarification for anybody who's watching out there and says, she said there's limited weight, that's in terms of one aspect of it. The other aspect is we are clearly expecting affordable housing contributions for student accommodation.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful to make that, and I think that's an important clarification. I've just got Councillor Merritt who wants to potentially suggest something.
Obviously hear what everyone else was, and to be fair, I wasn't at that previous hearing, so I've not had the opportunity to raise, and I take the points that what's been said about it being a narrow decision at that time, and we are where we are. But what I'd like to ask is whether it would be reasonable to include as an additional condition the requirement to agree to obtain a nomination agreement with one or both of the universities in line with the other aspect of policy H7, which is meant to be covered. Thank you.
So your officer's advice is that at this moment in time, with the point of where we are in terms of local plan, we don't think that's reasonable in terms of a planning condition that we could impose. That's officer's advice to you. That's just not something we think is reasonable.
So, Councillor Merritt, are you happy to take that advice as read, or yeah? Okay. In which case, it's been proposed and seconded. So, if I can see by show of hands, all those in favour of supporting the proposal. And anybody against? And any abstentions? So that's with one abstention, that is then approved. And I will just take the opportunity as well to thank the applicants for taking into account the considerations of the previous committee and addressing all of those considerations. It is very much appreciated. Okay. So I'm going to propose that we take a short adjournment now. I think if we can be back by 10 past, I make it just slightly before 5 past now. So just a 5-minute adjournment and then we move on to the next item. Okay, welcome back everybody to this evening's meeting of Planning Committee A. We're moving on to the next item on the plans list, which in our reports pack today is labelled as agenda item 5, and that is the British Sugar Corporation Limited, and it's a variation of conditions to the permitted application. So this is a little bit different than normal applications that we have, in so much as we're limited in the scope that we can discuss and debate and what we're making a decision on this evening. So just before we start the meeting, the item properly, I just want to make sure that members have their attention drawn to particularly page 136 and 137, which list the things that we can and can't discuss and consider the policy context. So in particular, paragraph 1.4, this application has been made to update the phasing plan. So phase 1 is infrastructure only, access to roads and public open space. It also proposes to vary the parameter plans and the details of the Spine Road Main Street. The ground levels are updated to suit the previously amended full planning application, and goes on to describe those variations. So it's not a rediscussion of the entire application. The principle has been established. It's about the variations within that. If there's any questions on the specifics of that, I will direct you to Becky, but I think hopefully members have read and understood, and that's clear. In which case, if Jonathan, you could talk us through the plans.
Thank you. Yeah, there's not much left for me to say following that introduction, but I'll take you through the parameter plan drawings that are submitted with the application. So this is the phasing plan, and this is one of the elements of the scheme that are proposed for alteration. Hopefully you can just make out the phasing numbers, but essentially that slide's maybe a bit, that's clear, isn't it? So phase 1 would be the access road that would go in. It's the dark blue that would go in through the former Manor School site and into the centre of the site. And then the second element of the road, which is the light blue that goes out at Millfield Lane, would come at a later date. So phase 1 is that first section of road, and then the green infrastructure and the strategic drainage, which is in green. And then in terms of the houses themselves, they would be subject to future reserve matters applications, which would specify all the details that we'd normally see in an application. So the arrangement of buildings, what they look like, etc. And essentially the first phase of houses is in the centre of the site here, and then it gradually works its way southish towards Plantation Drive. And then the second part is this northern section. The later phases are up here. So the phasing of the housing as such doesn't change. It just means phase 1 is infrastructure only and not any houses. And this building, this shows the proposed building heights. So this plan has also changed since the previous application. The previous, what's different is previously this area was the only area that was envisaged to be up to 3-storey. And other areas of the site would be 2.5 storey. So the scheme has changed here in that this dark brown area, it now acknowledges that these areas could be 3-storey as well. So they generally, as a principle, they follow around they front onto the main streets, and they would surround these areas of public open space at the north and south ends of the site. They're still a substantial distance away from surrounding houses. One of the amendments within the scheme, when it was first submitted, in this corner here where you've got a star, there was a proposal to have 3-storey here, but that was subject to some objections initially from council, the parish council in Poppleton and some of the residents opposite. So the scheme has been amended, and as you can see here, the 3-storey element is pushed back significantly from Millfield Lane, Low Poppleton Lane. And the parish council have put it on record as in the officer report that they're content with that change and have withdrawn their objection. This green infrastructure drawing, this has been amended as well. The two major changes are in this area of the site that runs parallel to the railway line. That's always proposed as being an area of drainage. It's proposed to be a swale area, and that's got more land take now. It's been developed up in further detail in comparison to the scheme that was approved last time. At this south end, the black hatched area is the alignment of a drain that's within the site. The drain sort of cuts across the southern parcel of housing at the moment, and the drain is in poor condition. So as part of the scheme, the drain is going to be replaced. So it's a new drain that's fit for purpose with a new lifetime. So this, because the drain's been replaced, and the opportunity has been taken to relocate it to the edge of the site. So that changes where the residential parcels of development are in this particular area. That's the same plan again. And these plans show the main street that runs through the site. The alignment of the main street is exactly the same as was approved last time round. The only changes to it are the detailed design, and they're only where, when it's been looked at again and applying current guidance such as LTM 120, it's been picked up that if we were redesigning it today, we would do it slightly different. So an example of one of the changes is here, if you can make it out, is this kind of change that where we've got the public footpath and cycle route that runs alongside the road, there's been a change that continues. It's still got priority at a junction. That's not something that was on the previous scheme, and that's the type of change that's picked up in these amended drawings. So these next following plans just show how the main street runs through the site. And again, they're essentially it's the same alignment as previous. It's just changes to the pedestrian and cycle routes, and how it keeps priority. These are the aerial photos, give you an idea of how the site is at the moment, and how it was profiled previously as a consequence of the industrial use. So the northern boundary of the site is along here, and then the other boundary is the railway line along here. This is the operational factory that isn't within the site. So this is where the existing access is on Millfield Lane, and that's moved slightly over to here. These are former playing fields that were associated with the school and that were associated with British Sugar. This next slide gives you an idea as to how there were sort of landscape bunds that were historically there to screen structures that were on site, as part of the approvals that have already been given to make the whole site level and allow it to be developed for houses. The profiles of these areas change, and they're acknowledged on the approved plans. The scheme has always kept some trees along here that can stay in, that don't get removed as a consequence of the reprofiling. And where trees are being removed, they're being replaced, and that's always been, there's not a change in that respect since the previous application. And then this is the southern end of the site. Again, the boundaries are along here with the housing and the factories in the green roof, and along here where there's an access road to the railway line. That's the extent of the presentation. There's an update I'll do after questions.
I'll take update after questions. Yeah. So any questions on the detail of the plans? Councillor Nelson?
One of the key changes, my understanding, is the movement of, I'm not going to be able to remember what the drain is called, but the big drain. Could you point out where it was originally and where it is now? So now I take it that's the black drain that you pointed out at the bottom of the site. But yeah, could you point out where in the original application that drain was, please?
So its current alignment kind of runs in kind of that direction. If that makes sense, it's all obviously underground, but and the hatched line on there shows the easement that it has. So hopefully you can imagine that it would leave, you've got quite a small triangle of land that's a bit severed from the rest of the site if the drain continues to run on that straight alignment, and that's why the proposal is to reroute it as part of the replacement works.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it might just be helpful, just for the benefit of anybody watching. So you talked about 2.5 stories and 3 stories. I know the difference, but if you can just explain the difference between a 2.5 and a 3-story, and also a swale, which isn't a particularly commonly used word in general parlance. So there may be some people who, are very familiar with it.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the building story heights, the scheme would predominantly be 2-story, and as part of the previous consent, it referred to 2.5 stories, which is essentially the eaves level. So the roof is still at the same building heights, but you've got accommodation within the roof space, is generally how that's perceived. So the effect of a 3-story is that the eaves level on the house where the roof begins is going to be a little bit higher. In terms of the drainage, so this area here is an attenuation pond, and because of the levels, the drainage sort of runs down in this direction. So the swale is along this alignment, which is essentially like a beck or a ditch with profiled sides. So it's an open drain rather than a closed drain. And the reason we do those are that they're promoted by, we've got a drainage hierarchy that we have to follow that promotes sustainable urban drainage. And the idea is that the open drains, the swale types, are of higher ecological value compared to just a sort of sealed drain that sits underground.
And that's for surface water runoff, not a general drain.
Yes, sorry, that's
just
correct.
So there's no confusion.
Yes, it would deal with the surface water runoff from the houses. Yeah, the foul is completely separate.
That's great. Thank you very much. Councillor Merritt.
Can I ask, on the 2.5 to 3-story, does that alter the number of rooms in the houses and therefore, in effect, the sort of mix of housing that we're going to get? And does it also affect the viability in terms of the potential for gaining additional affordable housing?
Yes to both. So the outline permission is up to 1,100 houses. It doesn't do anything to fix what that accommodation is as a mix. So that would be looked at each reserve matters stage, and we'd expect it to be broadly aligned with our housing need as and when those applications came forward. And it's correct that yes, it could add value to the scheme, because in square meters there could be more residential development. The numbers can't change, but the value of the houses could go up if they were bigger, essentially. So there's one way we'd control that, again, through that we'd expect a broad mix on each parcel. But what comes with this application, as part of the Section 106 agreement, there's a tool that allows you to look at viability with every reserved matters application. So there are some fixed inputs to that, such as the planning obligations that are fixed fees, but the variable inputs are, you'd reappraise it at every stage. So that, whether it's more or less development, that would be factored into the viability as we go along. So it could lead to a improved affordable housing offer over time, potentially.
Thank you.
Okay, no further questions on the plan specifically. Councillor Nelson.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask further to that. Since the actual housing themselves come forward in another application, almost right, how does this doesn't then set what that housing is that comes forward in the next application, does it? Does it set where they can and can't put 3 stories, for example? So obviously it says focus for 3 stories and predominantly 2 stories, but how much does this then put parameters in or directly link to when the actual application for housing comes in? Sorry if that sounds confused. I'm just kind of it seems to me that we're getting the housing separately. So why are we looking at the stories now, basically?
So we'd expect it to be broadly in compliance with this. So this sets out what the parameters are. What it also does, it's quite hard to see these on the plan, but we're also setting the ground levels, and these circles with the little numbers in them, they're maximum floor levels. So all the sort of heights are fixed. So essentially we'd be broadly, through this application, we'd broadly expect the development to come through in this way. So we'd say a reserve matters application, we'd be opposing it because it didn't accord with what we're setting now. If we had an application that proposed 4-storey houses next to existing 2-storey houses, for example, we'd expect it to essentially be in accordance with what we're fixing here. So there are some, what we refer to as parameters that we are fixing. So we're not fixing exactly what the houses will look like, but we are essentially saying that the building heights are going to be as per this plan, and the building parcels again are as per this plan.
Thank you. Sorry if that was a bit of a rookie question.
Okay, thank you. So if I could just invite Jonathan just to give us, there's 1 or 2 minor updates to the reports, which if you could just talk us through, and then we'll move on to the public speakers.
Yes, thank you. It's just some amendments to the conditions and to the informatives. So condition number 2, which there's just an error in the drawing that it refers to, the green infrastructure drawing. The revision number's incorrect, so it's just to amend the revision number from revision 6 to revision 7. Condition number 3, which relates to the drainage, it talks about how the surface water runoff needs to be attenuated and how all that's calculated and modelled. And it was just an oversight that some of the figures in there, the allowance that we apply for climate change still said 20% in the report that was published, and we've now, that's what it was before, but we've now moved to 30%. So it updates that and brings it up to date with current local guidance that we have. Condition 11, which relates to the main street and the design of it, and it's got some specifications about extra details that are required there. And something that we've picked up is near the community hub and the school, where there's some car parking spaces. There's a sort of highway, there's a verge area there, and it's been flagged up by highways that there is a risk that people might park on the verge, and it's not something that we would want. So we've added a stipulation that we use design measures, tree planting, for example, to stop people parking on the verge and parking in the appropriate parking spaces. Condition number 20, we're proposing to delete that condition because it related to the demolition of the manor school and measures to protect and provide mitigation for bats, and that work has all been carried out now. So that condition is not relevant anymore and can be deleted. In terms of the informatives, we've proposed to add an informative to make sure that the main street, whilst there were some detailed drawings for it, it's going to be looked at in further detail when it comes up for highways approval, and there are conditions that ask for its final design to be approved when the reserve matters come forward, and it's to flag up an expectation and requirement there that when we're looking in detail at the highway design, we'll be applying the LTM 120 guidelines in terms of inclusive travel and promoting walking and cycling.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move us then to the public speakers. We've had 2 registrations to speak. So the first person is Councillor Vassie. If you'd like to come to the table, and you are speaking, I believe, in objection, and you have 3 minutes to address the committee. And if I think you're going over, I will give you a heads up.
Thank you, Chair. I heard what you said in your opening words as well. I want to talk big picture here because someone has to. I wish to highlight the strategic defeat this application represents to the city after years of dithering. Our adopted climate change strategy says we must reduce carbon emissions from transport by 70% by 2030. So how does this proposal contribute towards delivering that declared reduction target? It doesn't. While cities across the UK and Europe are creating low carbon transport futures, Here in York, we continue to ignore opportunities staring us in the face, and our carbon emissions have dropped by nothing since 2000. Just look again at the plans in front of you. This site has a railway line along its edge. British Sugar were there because of the railway lines. That is our sustainable transport future right there. Anyone can see that light rail or a tram line following that existing railway line could provide 21st century public transport from this site through York Central onto the station in one direction, northwards to Poppleton and Skelton in the other direction, providing tens of thousands of people with an attractive, low-carbon public transport system. The tram line created in our twin city of Dijon carries 60,000 passenger journeys a day and earns the local authority 16 million euros a year. Here, in contrast, we earn our money from car parking, but we have a sustainable transport plan. Ask yourselves which city is delivering a sustainable transport strategy. Tinkering the cycle paths is not sustainable transport strategy, and we all know it. The strategic failure to tackle climate change will haunt this city in the decades ahead. You'll no doubt be given a dozen good reasons why nothing can be done. It's too late, the local plan, everything else. But in cities with effective leadership at political and administrative level, opportunities like this one are not ignored, they're acted on. The planning process does not encourage innovation or ambition. It's dominated by discussions about rules of what can't be done. But we desperately need energy, vision, and ambition if we're going to make our city find its future. Please grasp this chance to do what we're elected to do, to inspire those around us to face up to strategic opportunities and the challenges of our age. Planning officers can't do it. It's not their job, but you can. You decide. In my view, this site could and should be an exemplar of best practice, built around recognising that link to public transport and the railway. We could at least leave the development open to that in the future and not close the door by putting barriers all the way down there. Please think about what people will be saying about us and our city in 2040 if we allow another big development full of houses and cars to be built instead of embracing the opportunity of our age. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. If you just want to hang tight for a minute in case there's anybody has any questions.
I'm assuming everyone will be going, ah.
Councillor Stewart.
No, I think genuinely, I think it's absolutely fantastic that a member would come along to an application that's not in their ward or they have no link seemingly with to make the points that Councillor Vassie has. I think it's really, really positive. I think the question I've got, which you can almost anticipate, and I'm sure you're aware of it, is don't your remarks relate to the local plan working group and the council strategy and everything like that, rather than the planning committee particularly, and also when we are looking at one particular aspect of one particular planning application? And so if we were all Councillor Vassie's, how would we implement what you say?
I recognise exactly what you're saying, but I put back to you. It's always our time to make these decisions. There are always reasons why every meeting we attend, that's not the time to look at these kinds of issues. We can all rehearse the fact that the local plan is sitting in a tray somewhere behind a door with a leopard, you know, and all that kind of stuff. We're continuously delaying what needs to be done. We've got these commitments for 2030. Yes, you can argue to me, and I'm sure it will be argued, this is not the meeting to say this. But every time we abandon the opportunity to look at things that are obvious and to stand up and say, we're elected to represent people across the city now and in 10, 15, 20 years' time, we're just abandoning the opportunity we've been given. And that's why I turn up, because as far as I'm concerned, I know my children, my grandchildren will look at these decades, these times that we've missed opportunities and just think, what were we doing?
Thank you. I haven't got a question, but I will just address a couple of the points that you've made, just because I think it's relevant at this moment in time. We, as a committee on this occasion, do have a very restricted limit to what we can and can't do. And the existing permission that's been granted continues to exist. So this is a variation on the condition, but what has already been agreed to can already be built. I do completely agree with many of the points that you're making around how can we use both the planning process and the wider context of policy to actually start to deliver and stop just saying, because I think there is too much of that. And it's a very, very minor note of optimism, hopefully, possibly, but it's tiny. But page 158 of the report, in the informatives, number 8, there is an informative around the rail halt. And it does make clear that developers are reminded that the council has an aspiration for a rail halt to be developed at the north end of the site. So it's not that every last thing has been entirely discounted, but I do absolutely agree with, well, sympathise, agree with many of the points that you're making. The job of this committee is to ensure that we apply the legislation in the way that's appropriate according to the question that we're asked. And sometimes that means that we end up having to do things that we are limited in what we can and can't change, but we can certainly do it making the points that you're raising.
Was that a question I can respond to?
You may respond briefly if you wish.
I would just say I'm delighted to hear what you've said. And maybe this is a great opportunity for the committee to make it really clear that that little thing that's tucked in at the end is of importance and matters, so that the developer gets it and so that we all understand that there is always an opportunity to try and make things better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So next up, we have Neil Jones, who is the planning consultant speaking in support of the application. I'm sure you'll have noted the comments that have been made there as well. And thank you for the time that you've had to wait this evening before coming to address the committee. You have 3 minutes to address us. I'll give you a heads up if I think you're running over, and then there may be questions from members.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Neil Jones. I'm planning consultant at Rapley's, representing the applicant British Sugar. I will seek to address some of the points raised by Councillor Vassie as best I can. But I would like to say that the officer's recommendation for approval is very welcome, and the report before you provides a robust assessment of the planning merits of our application and a clear justification for the grant of permission. Our application seeks approval for minor amendments to the existing outline permission. As a result of technical assessment and design review, these amendments have become necessary to assist the progression of the development. The minor changes have been summarised by Jonathan, but in short, they are: 1, an update to the illustrative phasing plan, which ensures that the details of the strategic infrastructure will be submitted as the first phase. Number 2, updates to the approved parameter plans to include minor amendments to the drainage infrastructure, green infrastructure, and proposed building heights. Thirdly, updates to the main street to align with current standards. And fourthly, proposed ground levels are updated to be consistent with the full permission approved by the council to enable the creation of the development platform. A greater attenuation area for flooding is proposed, including swales and pond areas. And in addition, the car drain is relocated, which allows for an improved layout in the southern part of the site. Overall, the green infrastructure is increased. A slight increase in proposed building heights from 2.5 to 3 stories is focused around the main street and green infrastructure areas, but importantly away from existing neighbours. In terms of the climate change comments that we've heard, this application does include a bold target to reduce carbon emissions by 40% over predicted emission levels through various sustainable operation practices that will be introduced and covered over the reserve matters phases. British Sugar remains committed to facilitating the sustainable redevelopment of the site, which will provide much needed family homes and community facilities. This application comprises an important part of the overall planning and implementation strategy for the site. The officer report confirms that the proposals are acceptable and there are no objections or material considerations that justify refusal. These proposals build on the consented history and further assist in the delivery of the council's strategic allocation in its emerging and we hope soon to be adopted local plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And members, are there any questions? Councillor Stewart.
It's just a very general one. Does British Sugar, is British Sugar going to see it through right till the end? It's just sort of more out of interest really, because I just sort of thought they'd get planning permission and then pass it on to anybody. But and so when it came forward, I was quite surprised that it's still British Sugar doing it. Will they see it through until all the various houses are sold off?
At the moment, British Sugar is the sole landowner. And so the intention is that the reserved matters applications are all submitted pursuant to this outline application, which would be in the landowner's name, yeah.
And then they'll sell that at that point, or
so the various parcels of housing, the reserved matters phases would be marketed.
I think we're getting away from a planning issue. You don't need to answer that question.
Thank you.
Councillor Merritt.
Yeah, two questions, please. Para 3.2 refers to the arrangements in terms of the drainage features. And I note the comment that it says council will be unwilling to adopt these areas due to issues around maintenance. Are those issues going to be a problem in terms of getting an alternative provider for that maintenance and being able to achieve what's required?
The short answer to that is no. It is not going to be an issue. We've had lengthy discussions around the maintenance requirements for the drainage infrastructure, and we have proactively approached a number of private regulated operators who have expressed their ability and their interest in adopting and maintaining that infrastructure. And that information is submitted within the appendix of our planning statement. So in answer to your question, no, we don't foresee any issues with that.
Thank you. The other question is, can I ask as developer, what the rationale is for increasing the 2.5 to 3 stories?
Yes, of course. Yeah. As part of the overall design review, and as part of the sort of detailed work that has been taking place since the grant of the permission, we've obviously looked at what opportunities there are within the development to sort of improve various aspects. One of those was related to the green infrastructure, and on the back of that, there was felt to be an opportunity to have areas which gave more of a focal point to that green infrastructure. And one mechanism for doing that was having these focused areas of slightly increased building heights.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor Nils.
Thank you. On page 138, it talks about how there's because of the swales and additional above ground drainage infrastructure, that the updated scheme, the council would be unwilling to adopt it. And it says that the intention then is that it will be adopted by a third party. Will the cost of that then be reflected by management fees to residents?
Yes, I think overall that would be covered in service charge arrangements in the future, although I have to say I'm not entirely aware of the full details of that at this stage. That would be subject to a commercial agreement between the landowner and the private regulated operator that I referred to earlier.
Yeah, I can understand that. It just seems that the way that these reserved matters works is kind of if this site goes ahead with all of those things which are good on one side, that means that the balance is that once that work has been done, there has to be someone has to pay for it, which has to fall onto residents. Whereas if the council, if that scheme was, if the council were willing to adopt it, then that charge wouldn't be passed passed on to residents. So I just think that we probably need to, or any information you can kind of give on the plan to deal with that.
The only information I can really give you, because I'm not, clearly we're not at a stage where I have information on detailed service charges that might be, you know, attributable to residents, for example. But unfortunately, we're not in a situation where the council is willing to adopt that infrastructure, and therefore, as landowner, it's beholden on us to find alternative solutions, and that's what we've done.
Yeah, I can understand that. With that being the case, so my understanding is that the sort of previous version of that bit of land management, the council was willing to adopt. So one of the things that we're looking at now is the change from a scheme that, or an area of the scheme that the council was willing to adopt, to an area of the scheme that the council isn't willing to adopt. I'd just appreciate in that case, if you could maybe weigh up the pros and cons of the two different versions of that area of land and that kind of land management.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I can tell you is that in the existing Section 106 agreement, there was an option, and it was only an option, it wasn't confirmed, but there was an option that there could have been an eventuality where the council might have adopted it. Clearly, given the passage of time, that has changed, and the advice that we've received from officers is that that would not be the case. The council would not adopt it. And as I say, therefore, as landowner and developer, it's our responsibility to find alternative solutions. I can't really comment on the pros and cons of those because, you know, we're having to deal with the situation in front of us, which is that the council won't adopt.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
I'll just make the comment quickly because I think it's relevant at this stage. I did double check with officers just in terms of if there were to be future service charges, if there was an affordable housing element, how would that be dealt with? And there is a policy that will deal with an appropriate level of service charge mitigation for the different types of affordable housing on the site, because I know that has been something that committee members have had an interest in on previous applications. Just looking for any further questions to the applicant. Councillor, no, not seeing any other hands, and I'm just double checking whether I had any, and I don't think I did. So thank you very much for your time this evening. And if you want to just take your seat back in the public gallery, as it's grandly called, and we shall carry on with the determination. So we now move to questions from members for officers on either the update or the report. And Councillor Stewart, you were in there like a shot.
Yeah, it's for my education as much as anything, because I think Councillor Nelson's question was a good one. When we talk about these, the council will adopt or won't adopt. I mean, they always seem very much, you know, the council will take it on, whereas, you know, just keen to understand the sort of, surely some of these things should be about the council will take it on if the developer pays them an amount of money. Is that a sort of policy issue above us, or is that something that's not considered? Do you see my point? You know, yeah.
I mean, we have to look at it on a case by case basis, given the advice we're given by the specialist officers, I think. The specifics of this one, I'm going to defer to Jonathan on as to why we've got to where we've got to, but it's not a policy that per se we need to look to change. It's just, we have to look on each site how it would work and if we'd be prepared to adopt it. But there are specifics around this case and the change that I'm going to defer to Jonathan on.
Yes, there's no policy as such, but we are generally moving to a model whereby on the housing sites, the public open space within the site goes onto a management company rather than comes to the council for them to maintain, in part because of the resources we have around our ability to maintain public open spaces. So it is a fairly standard model and approach. The specific reasons for it in this particular case have arisen from the sustainable drainage solution and the space for it and the complexities with maintaining it. It's quite a tight arrangement, and that's why, as members have noticed, that the drainage engineer in his comments gives some commentary about the issues that we would have maintaining it as an authority, but other specialist companies are set up and are better resourced to deal with and manage things like the open swales, and that's kind of the trigger really that's dictated us in this situation, going down the route of it being something that a third party would manage rather than the council going forward.
It may be going forward that there are two separate service charges that they have to pay, probably one for open space and then one for this. That's not unusual on larger new developments, but that's probably what will happen.
I mean, on that point, yeah, I mean, that has been very much the norm, hasn't it, over sort of recent developments. I think, just from my point of view, obviously, again, it's not for this committee, but it does seem quite unfair that, you know, I live in a house where I have a road that goes by and the council pays for it, and I have drainage and the council pays for it, and the council pays for it, and then there's going to be houses a few hundred meters from my house where all of theirs will be paid for by an additional charge, not their council tax, not their parish precept, but an additional thing. And I think it's something we as a city do need to get right in terms of how this works. And for me, the obvious thing for where it would be, you know, got right is if the developer's doing something that the council's happy, yeah, we're totally indifferent about taking that on, and they do take it on. But if the developer's doing something which gives the council headaches, then there's a price paid for that by the developer, rather than have all of these things, you know, where there's more and more service charges, because, you know, we've had the leasehold sort of issue with properties, haven't we, nationally? And I think we're just making another one with all these different service charges. But you've been very kind, Chair, in letting me give that slight digression on things. But
I was very much enjoying hearing the former Conservative leader of the council arguing for better investment in communal infrastructure. So very, very happy to hear you taking that route. Councillor Nelson, I think you had a supplementary as well.
Yes, I did. I think from the kind of answers that we've had to this point, it sort of slightly shifts my understanding of this paragraph. So I just wanted to check that, I suppose, in terms of, I'm now thinking that what this is actually saying is the council was always probably unwilling to adopt this area, rather than that something has changed that has made the council more unwilling to adopt it. Are we looking at something that's quite like actually from the application as it went in originally, or where it was before this reserve matters, it was highly unlikely the council was going to adopt that anyway?
It's kind of correct that it was a tricky thing for the council to maintain all along, but there has been a fundamental change in that the proposals for the drainage have changed, and the space that's required for the swales is larger, and there's less space to maintain them, and that's sort of been the trigger point, that there isn't enough space within the master plan to maintain the swales without sort of highly specialised equipment that the council would have to acquire and use and to maintain a site. And essentially we don't have lots of swales that we have to maintain elsewhere, so we don't have a fleet of these specialist equipment that would need to manoeuvre and maintain in a narrow space. So that there has been a change here that's triggered the change in position about on-site maintenance.
Thank you. And there's no way it would be reasonable to ask for the purchase of specialised material as part of Section 106 or application kind of additions?
It's not the advice that specific department obviously doesn't feel that, whilst we could ask for a fee to acquire the equipment in the first place, it wouldn't be an efficient use of our resources to store and use that equipment, because it's not widespread use across the city.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions for officers? Councillor Nelson.
Sorry, thank you. I was going to let someone else ask one, but no one seemed to put their hand up. I did have a separate question about just the drainage in general, because I am not a drainage expert and I've never heard of a swale before. Are you as officers, and are we? It seems to me like the changes to drainage have been positive changes, and changes that we would be happier with than what they were before. More sustainable, greener, something along those lines, and potentially with less infrastructure and more kind of natural. But I'm not a drainage expert, so I would just appreciate a steer on how we feel about the changes to drainage.
The principles of the drainage strategy are the same. It's always been a sustainable approach. It's just as the schemes evolved, it takes more space now than it did before. So it's always been a sustainable drainage solution. It's just the land take pushes it further towards the development parcel than it did before.
But that gives it more capacity in terms of flooding and climate change and those good things that we want to see.
Yes, and as we mentioned in the update, that it's got the allowance for climate change has ramped up since we approved it last time. So you have to make a bigger allowance for climate change than you did last time round when we considered the application. So yes.
Okay, so I will move us into debate then. So again, I'm just looking for anything that people want to take into consideration, any indication. I'm not looking for a proposal at this stage, but just a sense of where people feel that we are on this. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. It seems an awful long time since, it probably was maybe before I joined the council when this all started. So it's good to see movement, even though there's nothing physically happening on the ground. But this is a positive sign, and I have no problems with the amendments being proposed. On the issue of open space management, I'll send Councillor Stewart a link to a scrutiny report produced 2-3 years ago, which recommended that wherever possible, open space on new developments is managed by the council to try and avoid some of the issues of additional cost burden on new residents. Yeah, we made a recommendation, but it hasn't really gone, hasn't really flown, but you never know. But yeah, I'm happy to support.
Thank you. Might be worth flagging those recommendations to the new administration and see if they take hold. Well, hopefully he knows them intimately then. Any further comments that anybody else wishes to make? Councillor Nelson.
For the purposes of this section of the meeting, I feel like it's relevant to say I agree with Councillor Fenton, and it seems to me that the things within this are mostly increase in biodiversity, increase in capacity for kind of future planning, you know, slightly better infrastructure and slightly better plans that were in before. The 2.5 height to 3 story height doesn't seem to be a massive change. It's not even like it was from 2 to 3. It's really positive that they've taken into account the objections of the parish council. I think if your parish council or local planning committee are on board, then it's generally a good sign. And yeah, I welcome the kind of improvements that it seems to show to ecology and to all of those things. And I don't see a reason why it shouldn't go through, to be honest. I look forward to hearing how they're going to cut carbon by 40% in the future.
Okay, thank you. Just for my brief comments, I was just going to highlight that 40% reduction in carbon that was mentioned, and would hope and assume that all steps are taken to make this development as efficient heat wise and you know, all of those things that contribute towards that. I do think that Councillor Bassey in some of the points that he raised during public participation is right in terms of we do seem to keep building in car dependency into schemes. So I would hope again that as this scheme is developed out, that every opportunity is taken to ensure that it's possible to live here without being entirely dependent on a vehicle to go about your daily business, because I think we do need to be thinking about that. And with that in mind, I did think it was very positive that the infrastructure was being updated to reflect the LTN 120 guidelines. And again, I would hope that that's something that all developments coming forward of this nature and this size will be taking into account and including. So I think we can move then to testing the officer recommendation, and this is down recommended for approval. Councillor Merritt, were you wanting to jump in on
Yeah,
that?
happy to move with the updates.
Sure, and Councillor Woodby?
Seconded.
Okay, so Becky, if you could just summarise where we are.
So the
Sorry.
The application is recommended for approval as outlined in the case officer's report, also subject, I'm just finding the right page for you, just a second. It is, just 2 seconds. Yeah, so it's recommended for approval subject to a section 106 agreement that is delegated to myself. Subject to the conditions in the report, the conditions that Jonathan highlighted, and the verbal condition update that he gave as well. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if I can see by show of hands, all those in favour of supporting that proposal. I believe that is unanimous, and so therefore that is approved as described. That then brings us to the end of today's meeting. So thank you everybody for your time, and we will see you next time.